Hello, everybody. I think our broadcast is live. Senator Bernard, do you want to take us away?
Thank you, Senator Kutcher. We're really pleased, the two of us are really pleased to be hosting this series of Facebook Live to discuss issues related to systemic racism experienced by Indigenous, Black, Asian, and other racialized peoples. The COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted both the social and cultural injustice, including data showing that the virus disproportionately affects Indigenous and Black communities. The purpose of this series is to continue conversations related to racial injustice and the effect it has on racialized people, and how to create courageous spaces for such difficult conversations, and how we can reset our institutions to ensure they are intersectional and representative of the Canadian population.
Thanks very much for that. And I'm Senator Stan Kutcher. It's my pleasure to introduce one of our esteemed colleagues, Honorable Lillian Dick, who was the first First Nations woman and first Canadian-born Chinese person to be appointed to the Senate. During her 15 years in our chamber, she represented the province of Saskatchewan, was a tireless advocate for Indigenous women. Senator Dick worked to remove sexism in the Indian Act, which long stripped status for First Nations women married to non-First Nations men, and advocated for the families of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Welcome, Senator Dick.
Welcome, thank you.
Senator Dick, we're so pleased to have you come out of retirement to join us today. And now it's my pleasure to welcome our second guest, Dr. Wesley Crichlow. Dr. Crichlow is an interdisciplinary youth scholar and community activist. Pardon me, I'm just getting over a cold. My apologies. Who works with socially and economically disadvantaged youth, engaging in youth and community empowerment. Dr. Crichlow is a professor in the Faculty of Social Science and Humanities at Ontario Tech University and is the current chair of the President's Equity Task Force. His current research interests include gender, sexuality, and Black diaspora Caribbean masculinities, critical race theory, and intersectionality, and Black youth scholarly mentoring. Dr. Crichlow, we are so delighted that you've taken time from your busy schedule to be with us today. And we're going to start our conversation with me asking you the first question. Many people are confused about what systemic racism is. Can you tell us what your understanding of systemic racism is? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you for having me on the show, and a pleasure to meet you all. I think it's an easy concept and yet so complex in the sense that I think to best understand systemic racism, we have to understand Canada's history of colonization of Indigenous people, Canada's history of institutionalized enslavement of African people, and the pre-Confederation French, British colonial regimes, which created policies and institutions to reflect their sense of privilege and entitlement. So when we are talking about systemic racism, we're always talking about barriers that operate through policies and practices that seemingly appear to be neutral in their face, uniformly applied. So why question them? Everybody has to fill an application. Everybody has to be interviewed. Everybody has to apply for the job. And therefore, but the outcome of it, because of its neutral perception, is always negatively impacting differential groups. And those groups are the groups that have historically been disadvantaged as a result of colonization, enslavement, etc. Systemic discrimination can be best described as normative patterns, behavior policies, practices that are part of a structure or an organization which create and perpetuate barriers of inequality. And I think the Justice Rosalia Beller best summed this up when she said, in her report on employment equity. She says, discrimination means practices or attitudes that have, whether by design or impact, the effect of limiting an individual or a group's right to the opportunities generally available because of attributed rather than actual characteristics. It's not a question of whether this discrimination is motivated by intentional desire to obstruct someone's potential, or whether it is the accidental byproduct of innocently motivated practices or systems. If the barriers affecting certain groups in a disproportionate negative way, it is a signal that the practices lead to this adverse impact of systemic discrimination. So I think that is it from a legal standpoint in terms of the Employment Equity Act and my lay expression of it.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
I thought that one of the really important points that you made, Professor, was that these barriers to equality exist whether we are aware of them or not.
Yeah.
I think that is so important.
Yeah.
Thank you for focusing on that.
Yeah.
And just to add the other structural piece of this conversation, I'm going to ask Senator Dick just with this question to start off. What does intersectionality mean to you? And what would you want people to understand about your experience working and living this?
Well, you know, it's funny that you would ask a neuroscientist what intersectionality means. I've spent my life in the sciences, but intersectionality to me, I don't like the term, to be frank, because as a scientist, sections mean separate and discrete. You cut things up, right? And when you're dealing with people and interactions, it's you can't separate things out so cleanly. And intersectionality also implies that it's additive. And I don't think that race and gender, for example, are additive. So in my case, for example, I'm a female. I'm part Cree and I'm part Chinese. How do I determine, in terms of racism and sexism, which part of me is being affected? Because it's all one being. And so the races, particularly the sex and the race part, for me has always been a difficult one to figure out, because when I worked at the university, I was the only female scientist in my department for however many, 25 years. And I suffered a lot of discrimination. But I think in that case, most of the discrimination was towards my gender because I was a woman. However, underlying that, of course, is the race aspect. Mm-hmm. In my years in the Senate, 15 and a half years in the Senate, I think that particularly in the last 2 years when we were dealing with important Indigenous issues, I think there was overt anti-Indigenous racism. But the fact that I was a female, I think, made it worse. Mm-hmm. Because, in my opinion, women who are a visible minority or maybe audible minorities are treated worse than their male counterparts. So I think we need a different term than intersectionality, because as I hope you gather from my comments, it's multiple, that we're not one or the other. And they intersect in ways that we don't understand. And sometimes I think that particularly for a woman, the interaction is synergistic. It's much more than additive. Mm-hmm. So I think I think those are the points that I wanted to comment with respect to intersectionality.
So we could even understand it that the sum of all these components would actually be greater. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts.
That's right.
Individual who was class or age or culture or citizenship, but these are other components. That impact of those could be greater than each one of those taken separately.
Yes, and it could also have a different outcome. Now, for example, when you think about the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women, Indigenous women are more likely to be victims of crime. But for Indigenous men, they're more likely to be incarcerated. They're more likely, conditions have put them where they're more likely to be in situations where they're put in jail, where they're forced, in a sense, to engage in criminal activity. the poverty and that kind of thing. So there's a different gender dimension there with respect to the Indigenous population.
Mm-hmm.
That's a really interesting point you're making around this whole notion of intersectionality, and really interesting to see the scientific lens being put to it. I come from it from a social scientist lens. And so my social science lens actually likes the notion of intersectionality. I've actually talked about that notion of being caught at the intersections of different social locations. And I sort of envision this web, this interlocking web of identities. And depending on how many of those you embody or may be perceived as embodying, then you're going to be facing various barriers as a result of that, because of that sort of interlocking nature of how these different oppressions play together. And so as a racialized woman, as a woman of African descent, I've also experienced multiple experiences of these sort of intersections. I've been caught with many of these intersections through my whole career, as well as you have.
Well, I like the idea of a web, because in many Aboriginal cultures, there's this idea of the web of life where everything is interconnected. Yes. And if you pull on one strand, it interconnects with the whole web and you don't know where it's going to end up.
Yes, that's how I see the intersectionality. And depending on which string is being pulled at any given time. And oftentimes we don't know which string is being pulled. And when we're sort of having the experience or living the experience, I think part of our analysis has to be, so what is this about? And oftentimes it's not a discrete, okay, this is because of race, this is because of gender, this is because of class. It's often happening because all of those things are at play. That web is interlocking. Professor Crichlow, I can see you shaking your head. So do you want to jump in and add something to this?
Well, again, I'm from the social sciences background like yourself. And so it has been a term that was popularized by Black feminists. And it's a concept, I think, in which intersectionality lends itself to understanding the what I would call the matrix of domination, in which this matrix of domination operates in such a way that these multiple forms of compounding and intersecting forms of domination that operate at the same time, and you cannot be additive, as the Honorable Lillian Dick said earlier, but rather it has to be constitutive. So you don't add a gender, then you add class, but it's developing a very nuanced, complex understanding of how domination as a whole exists. And if we are talking about racialized people, we're talking about white supremacy. If we're talking about women, we're talking about patriarchy plus white supremacy. And so it's understanding how these different forms of domination based on power feed into each other and reproduce this notion of this inequality at multiple levels. If we don't understand those multiple levels, then I think we end up with a very skewed understanding of how one person is impacted from a systemic standpoint, because systemic discrimination, which appears to be so neutral on its surface, but reproduces inequality, could be a good place where I think intersectional analysis that engages, where we looked at grounded in the thinking of domination. It helps us understand these identities in specific locations, but based in terms of decades and histories of oppression at the same time. And we can't do intersectionality without a historical audit.
Well, one of the things, now I'm going to speak as a developmental neuroscientist and a PhD dropout in history. So my goodness gracious, that has me lose on all sides. One of the things that I think about with this is that there are formative components to this early on in life. Young people are faced with some of these challenges, but they don't go away early on in life. They intersect and have different expressions over the lifespan. So as young people go from the family to the larger community, and then are exposed to organizations and structures within those communities, many of these come to play over time. and they can have tremendous impacts on people.
But if we understand the concepts that inform dehumanization or the concepts that inform inequality, there's a common thread. And that thread depends on particular idea of human beings at work in a racist society or in a sexist society. So an obvious feature of racism is the rejection of having relationships with members of certain races. So when you say one is born into a particular group, I'm saying that that's already a form of inequality. Some folks are born into cycles of dependency and poverty and never come out of it. So in that sense, I think where we understand intersectionality from a perspective of understanding the historical forms of domination, this is where I think it helps us unearth these historical places of inequality.
If I could just add a slightly different perspective, I think one of the most difficult things about being sort of on the receiving end is you're always trying to figure out what's going on in the mind of the oppressor. And so we should be analyzing people that are oppressors and what is in their minds and in their upbringing that allows that kind of behavior for them to, be instilled in childhood or whatever and to be maintained throughout their life. For instance, with sexism and violence against women, we tend to study women and why they're vulnerable, but really we need to be studying the men and why they're violent in order to end violence against women. We have to be studying the men who are conducting the violent acts, and that would be the same in racism. What has gone on with those people that engage in racist behaviors and acts that have brought them to that point and allowed them to continue?
And I also think when we think of intersectionality, it allows us to address the specificity of racism to each group. Anti-Black racism as a form of racism grounded in the specificity of the history of enslavement of Black people, and racism is not the same. So when we look at racism compounded with anti-Black racism, with systemic discrimination, with structural racism, it gives us this form of understanding how the concepts informing that dehumanization really is grounded in, and what's the kind of, work we have to do to unearth it.
I think that is really a prescient observation, and if I can just comment that the work is hard. It causes discomfort. Senator Bernard and I talked about this recently, the incredible discomfort that it causes, but it also involves, Senator Dick, cognitive challenge. It's not, if we just stay with the emotional component, that's easy. And that'll take us in the wrong direction. But it demands cognitive reframing. It's hard work.
Yeah.
But at the center of this is power, unequal power, right? And I think it's another area we're not really willing to discuss in deep ways, because if we look at why racialized communities are impacted more heavily, severely impacted by COVID than non-racialized communities, it's a kind of work they do, which is known as racial capitalism. Their labor is used in a particular way for racialized labor, which is frontline labor, the store work, the Amazons of the world, warehouses, etc. They have to go to work in buses that are overcrowded, subways that are overcrowded. So racial capitalism reproduces this particular market of people disposable for capitalism. And that is deeply about power. So if we understand how power frames that, I think then we'll understand what it is we need to change. But to give up power, one must be willing to share resources. And I'm not sure we have ever reached to the point of asking, how can we share these resources? How can we engage in questions of retribution? And how can we engage in questions of reparation? And these are questions I think they will come eventually and I'm hoping that Senator Bernard will continue pushing those issues in terms of reparation. But these are central issues as we talk about structural racism and anti-Black racism.
Well, I can't help but notice you said sharing of resources. And of course, in the Indigenous communities, that is a huge issue. And we are in a situation where Canada has yet to really recognize the treaties. And if the treaties were properly recognized, there would be a sharing of resources. And it would diminish incredibly the poverty that many Indigenous people face. So resources is a huge part of it. And treaties, well, You know, it's been over 150 years, and we were still trying to settle many of them, especially here in the prairies.
That's a really good point. And I think the whole idea of sharing power, using privilege to effect change is an important direction that we all must move to if we're really going to address systemic racism. And I'm wondering if you could both share some ideas with our audience about strategies that you think could be used to address systemic racism and the intersecting web of
I would, if you don't mind me going first, I think I want to look at work, because I think bread and butter is so central to how we keep our principles intact. You know, it's the whole idea that hunger has no principles, according to I can't remember his name will come back to me. It's a famous quote in which when you look at that and you look at why folks are going to work every day despite COVID spread, it's a lack of worker protection. So I think this is, for me, a fundamental issue, is worker protection and benefits. We cannot erode workers' rights. We cannot say they're essential workers, but not give them essential benefits for living. We cannot say they're essential frontline workers and only speak about doctors and nurses, and then suddenly forget that there's this group of essential workers in grocery stores and pharmacies and warehouses that is contribution to extra pollution of the environment through all these big box shipping. So I think we have to understand, when we talk about, we have to humanize, rehumanize, and reconceptualize what humanity means when we talk about essential workers. And to do so, I think we have to put into the center of essential workers the folks who often put bread and butter on our table in terms of food. And what does that mean for those folks to not have that choice between going to work and staying home because they don't have a paid sick leave day? Not going to work because going to work because they're afraid they would lose a job, going to work because they have to take care of extended families, going to work because sometimes it means leaving the home to provide room for others, so the time they come home, room can be shared again for others who are doing shift work in the house. All these issues of overcrowding in these homes, where some folks go to work not because they want to go to work, because they want to create space in the house too. So when we think about racial capitalism, I think these are fundamental principles to understand when we talk about inequality. So I think it's, for me, worker rights is central to how we get people's principles and dignity back intact.
Absolutely. Workers' rights, that's great.
Well, with regard to Indigenous issues, I think it really does go back still to the issue of treaties. And there was a program some years ago, the Treaty Land Entitlement set up that happened here in Saskatchewan, and now it's, I believe, acted in Manitoba, because land is considered to be the basis of your resources. If you have land, you can have wealth. And because the land was pretty much taken away from Indigenous people, it's been very difficult to get the resources from that land to be able to get out of poverty. Mm-hmm. So I think the government, the federal government in particular, along with the provincial governments, should really actually put some teeth into and some real commitment into resolving the land issues. And in Saskatchewan, even with Crown land, we have a situation now where Crown land should be given to the Indigenous people of Saskatchewan first, but it's not. It's being put up for sale, and Indigenous people don't have the right of first refusal. So land and treaty making is part of it. There have, I think, been good programs. And I think if we look at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that was one of the steps forward. We have the documents, the calls to action. We need to put some teeth into that. People, I think, tend to give up because it's complicated. It's a long-standing issue. But, incremental change can make a huge difference. So we have to continue to push and make sure that we get the rights recognized of Indigenous people, because it's been way too long. And, honestly, sometimes I just shake my head thinking how, like the status issue for women. It was 150 years that women lost their Indian women lost their status just simply because they married a non-Indian man. Whereas if an Indian man married a white woman, he didn't lose his status, and she, the white woman, became an Indian woman. Like,
Right.
what sense does that make? So 150 years later, hopefully that's laid to bed, at least legally it is.
Mhm.
Well, there seems to be no end to nonsense.
Yes.
Everywhere that we look at it, and you know, one of the things that I want to share with you, I grew up son of refugees, came to after the war, survived and got here, and I went through the school system here, but no, and I actually ended up studying history, including Canadian history, but nowhere in my educational experience as a kid did I learn history from the lens of Indigenous or Black or any other racial group or cultural group at all. None.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have to start with education, or should education simply be one of the things? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, you pointed out something really, really important. I, too, never received any really history of Indigenous people throughout my schooling, and I thought it was just simply because I moved around so much as a kid. But it's a common theme, and the TRC pointed that out as well. That is slowly changing, but education certainly is a key to moving forward, because lack of education and ignorance underlies a lot of the racist behavior, where people assume that Indigenous people are poor because, you know, it's their own fault, because they're lazy, or, you know, whatever, all these terrible stereotypes. But if they knew why Indigenous people were put on reserves and so on, they would recognize it's not our fault. It's not their fault.
Yes, absolutely. We're coming near the end of our time, and the time has gone so quickly. It's pretty incredible when you think about it. A couple of things I want to highlight that I've heard from you today. The need for us to ensure that we're really looking at the root causes. So looking at the treatment of Indigenous people in this country and the need for immediate action around we have the calls to action from the DRC. What's taking so long to get us there? So really looking at that, and the whole notion of racial capitalism. When I think about that, and I think about how slavery flourished because of capitalism, it makes you stop and think. We really need to make those links more strongly, and the whole need for education and changes in education, but also commitment from those in positions of power, for those with the privilege, for those who are able to influence, to do so, to lead that change, to share the power to lead that change. I want to mention two authors. Dr. Crichlow talked about the term intersectionality coming from Black feminists. And oftentimes we don't name who these folks are. And I'm thinking some of our listeners may want to do further work. So the two that have influenced my work, or maybe three that have influenced my work the most, would be Patricia Hill Collins, Kimberly Crenshaw, and Bell Hooks. And I think those are names that people can certainly read their work to learn more about that notion of the web of intersectionality. And I'm hoping talking about the web of intersectionality makes it a bit more comfortable for you to think about, Senator Dick.
Yes.
Well, if I could just chime in here, I think that this has been a good start. This is an incredibly long journey. When I look back on the history of these challenges, I just shake my head and I say, enough is enough. I think that everybody that's watching this, each one of you can do something. You know, not all people are parliamentarians, not all people are professors, but each one of us can do something. And I think it's really important for us to look in our own lives at what are the things that we can do so that we can do those things that need to be done. And I think I heard that from people.
Yes. Thank you both so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
My pleasure.
Thank you. To all of those who are with us today watching, and to those who will view this once it's archived, we invite you to join us for each of the next 7 Mondays at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Have a good day. Take
Bye.
care.